Deborah Seligsohn is the principal advisor on China climate and energy for the World Resources Institute. Prior to joining the World Resources Institute, she served for 20 years at the U.S. State Department, where she worked on energy and environmental issues related to China, India, Nepal, and New Zealand. She has an exciting blog. For those of you who haven't read it, I encourage you to do that. She has a master's degree from Princeton and BA from Harvard.
I'm going to talk about environment a little bit differently, as what I've seen as the growing incorporation of environmental goals into the notion of development in China. And I'm really talking about protection of the environment and not about environmentalism or an environmental movement, which is not actually very large in China. I'll start by discussing 5-year plans, because I think everyone should live according to them, and I try to do that myself. But in China, and I'll talk a little bit, most of this will be talking about how this came to be. The 11th 5-year plan, which was 2006 to 2010, was a real watershed in how the Chinese looked at the environment and what they saw as goals and what they saw as the possibility for making real changes. And so they set some fairly ambitious but realistic goals for what they wanted to achieve in terms of both energy conservation and environmental protection. And then for the first time ever, they achieved their goals. There had been environmental targets in earlier 5-year plans. In fact, there had been more environmental targets in earlier 5-year plans. And I think the great genius of the State Environmental Protection Administration, which it was called at the time, was to pick just a couple of targets and then really work very hard to get them and to prove to the rest of the government and to the public that they actually meant business and they could actually make changes. And while these changes were not enough to give people, really great air quality and really great water quality, they were enough to show that they could really make a difference. And so what you saw in the 11th 5-year plan, where there were these goals to reduce energy intensity, so energy use per unit GDP, by 20%, and to reduce the emissions of sulfur, which is an air pollutant, and chemical oxygen demand, which is a measure of water pollution, by 10% each. Both of the environmental goals were actually exceeded, the sulfur one by a considerable margin, actually, and we have good satellite data to show that that's for real. And the energy intensity one, and I forgot to put the minus in when I rearranged the chart, so that should be minus 19.1%. They got pretty darn close. And I actually would argue that the fact that they got close and didn't claim they made it was an incredibly positive sign. They actually were giving you real data instead of making up a number, and that's always a good idea. So what they were able to do when you look forward to the 12th 5-year plan, which started last year and will run through 2015, was to add a bunch more goals. So there are new goals for those same targets, and then there are also goals for an additional air pollutant, nitrous oxides, and for an additional water pollutant, ammonium nitrogen. So those are pretty important goals that will help address additional problems with pollution. This would never be the way you'd choose to do it if you did an optimality equation in economics. You would try to figure out all the pollutants you needed to control and figure out how much of each. Institutionally, that's not going to work. And by focusing, they get a lot more done. And I think it's a real virtue of the system. There are also goals for forestry. The Chinese have done pretty well on that. I think Suda's point about as you can protect domestically, you start to take more internationally is a valid point in this regard. But it is true that most of the Chinese forests are pretty marginal land, and being able to protect them is really good, especially for the watershed. So those are, and then of course with Copenhagen they added a carbon intensity goal. The carbon intensity goal, if you look at the energy intensity goal and then the carbon intensity goal, what you'd see is most of what the carbon intensity goal is about energy efficiency, and then a small fraction of it will be achieved through the addition of non-fossil energy. And they have an ambitious goal to get non-fossil energy to be 15% of total primary energy consumption by 2020, and the goal is then for 2015 that it'll be 11.4% of total energy consumption. I did want to talk about energy because the thing is the energy intensity is closely tied to environmental outcomes because so much of air pollution and a considerable amount of water pollution is caused by energy use. And what you see in terms of energy intensity is that most countries increase their energy intensity per unit GDP through a significant part of their development trajectory and then start to decrease again. What you see in the case of China is just a much, much more dramatic increase and decrease than you see for any other country. If you look at the United States, it took decades and decades to really get energy intensity down, whereas in China you see this skyrocketing around 1960 from a country that was basically not using much energy at all, and then this slow and not very steady, but long-term effort to reduce energy intensity. But it's particularly important in terms of the current debate because it hasn't been smooth in recent years. So we had this long period where China actually had some very good policies pushing energy intensity down, really improving the quality of power generation equipment, advice to industry on efficiency. And then around the early 2000s, that kind of fell apart. And they had this period where energy intensity went the other way. Now, both Japan and Korea had a similar period similar phenomenon during their period of rapid expansion. In fact, in the case of those countries, that period where energy intensity turned the other way went on for much longer. The interesting thing about China is they very rapidly became concerned that this was a bad idea, and they instituted these new policies in the 11th Five-Year Plan, and they managed to turn it around actually quite quickly. But they did essentially lose a decade of this downward trajectory because basically at the end of the 2010, the first decade of this millennium, they were pretty much back where they were at the start of that decade. So it is an ongoing challenge. That's all I'm going to talk about, what they've managed to accomplish. And if you have more questions on whether it's true or not, we can deal with those in the Q&A. What I'm going to talk about is why did this happen? Why did China go from being a country that seemed rather oblivious to the air pollution that when I first moved to Beijing in 1984 was so thick that chunks of coal would wind up in my hair and everywhere else, to a country where everybody's concerned about it and discussions of air pollution light up the blogosphere on a daily basis. So there were a lot of reasons why these issues came to the fore. And the first of these actually is energy security. Energy security has been traditionally an issue of great concern to the Chinese. I think if you have studied any Chinese history, you may have read about the Sino-Soviet split. The Soviet Union was giving China most of its oil at the time of the split, and China was left with none, and then had this sort of miraculous moment where they found one of the largest oil fields on Earth at Daqing in the early 1960s, and suddenly powered that tremendous growth in energy that I showed you 2 slides back. But that idea that energy security was a really fragile issue, that having independence in energy was really important, predominated Chinese thinking up through the beginning of the 1990s. And then they suddenly went into this period where the economy was growing fast. It became quite clear they were about to be importing a lot of oil, and world oil prices were quite stable in the 1990s. So what had seemed like it was going to be a policy crisis went by almost unnoticed and was not a big issue in the 90s. Administering energy was not a hot-button topic, and that's in fact part of the reason why the energy intensity went in the wrong way, because when they did government restructuring at the end of the decade, the energy conservation part of the government seemed like one of many, many institutions that they might just eliminate. And so you started the 2000s without much of an infrastructure. And then what happens, if you look at this graph around 2004, 2005, slide, you'll see where it suddenly drops precipitously downward. In 1 year, Chinese oil imports went up 16% at a time when world oil prices were rising very fast. The rhetoric in the United States, if you can remember back that far, and you'll hear it again this year, I'm sure, was that it was all China's fault. They were buying up all the world's oil. Even though China at that point was 9% of global oil consumption, and you may recall they're about 20% of the world's population. But anyway, they were getting a lot of international criticism. It was also reflected in a number of votes in Congress in 2005. There was a vote on whether to finance the selling of nuclear power plants to China, where the Congress said they didn't want that done. Actually, the administration went ahead and did it anyway. But there was also a vote on a proposed merger between CNOOC, a Chinese oil company, and Unocal. Again, that was a sense of the Congress resolution, but in the end, CNOOC decided they were never going to get the deal and pulled out. They started to think that their ability to acquire energy resources elsewhere in the world, whether it be technology, like a nuclear power plant, whether it be an oil company, and in the case of Unocal, almost none of their assets were in the United States. They were in many parts of the rest of the world, that they were going to run into a lot of economic friction, and they were going to run into a lot of political friction wherever they went. And what seemed like a really good way to address this? Get out that energy conservation stuff again. The less energy you're using, the less friction you're going to have. And so one of the big drivers of this policy is the more efficiently you use it, the less other problems you have and you're dealing with the rest of the world. So energy, and then they had huge snowstorms and problems supplying domestically as well, just because of transport. 2007, huge snowstorms. So energy security is also about security of domestic supply. And anything you can do to reduce quantity relieves the supply chain, relieves the stress. It's kind of a triple win. So another major point in why China has really turned around on these issues has to do with just being richer. And I think this graph is fairly useful for giving you a sense of how much richer China is today than it was in 2000. I mean, most of that increase happens from 2000 to 2010. If you grow at 10% a year, your economy doubles every 7 years. They've been growing at an average of over 10% a year for 30 years. And that just means that every 7 years, every Chinese is living in a country that they were not living in 7 years earlier, by any stretch of the imagination. And it just changes your perception of what the world has to offer. I think it's also important to remind Americans that we haven't exactly stayed poor during this period. Look at that graph on top. The US has also gotten a lot richer over the last 30 years and continues to be richer than China. And this is just absolute GDP. This is not per capita GDP, where the difference, of course, is much larger since China notably has a lot of capitas. So the first thing to think about is just this sense of possibility. The sense of possibility was, I think, brought home in a lot of ways by the WTO accession. Huge boost in China's GDP growth and trade. Whether it was WTO accession itself or the institutional changes that were needed for WTO accession is a complex argument, and there are people on both sides. For the purpose of my argument, it doesn't matter. The fact that they could make those institutional changes gave them a great deal of institutional confidence. Next thing that happens, SARS hits. And SARS hits just as China's new administration comes into office, President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao. They literally came into office as Guangdong had shut down, and within a month of them taking over control, all of Beijing was completely shut down. And they realized social issues could affect economic development. That the model of the 1990s, where the solution to political problems was to focus on the economy, get people richer so those students wouldn't be unhappy, wasn't enough. That your economy could actually potentially be sent off the rails from a social issue. Transformed the public health system in China and expanded the notion of what you needed to do to deal with development. They also came into power at the time when there was a very, very famous case of a college graduate who got caught up in the net for where migrant workers were often picked up on the street, and he was beaten to death. And suddenly, again, in both the case of SARS and in the case of that, the middle class and the urban population started to realize that a lot of these issues affected them, issues that they thought of as dealing only with kind of the other, health issues, policing issues. Suddenly they felt threatened. And so Hu and Wen put a much greater emphasis on changing the way social issues were addressed. Didn't yet have a whole lot to do with environment, but a bunch of things started to change that. And those were, as usually is the case, environmental disasters. And the transforming moment for China was really the Songhua River spill in 2005, which was really, I think, in many ways, the Chinese Exxon Valdez. It was an enormous environmental disaster that was discussed in the entire country. It was covered on TV nightly. People were really, really angry. It was the major oil company's facility that had spilled. Blame was probably misallocated to the head of the Environmental Protection Administration. The oil company is more powerful than a sub-ministerial body at that point. But the point was people demanded a head and they got it, and then he was rewarded the next year by being made climate change minister. So, but I think it really did change, and it helped the state environmental Protection Administration, one, to get good goals in the 11th Five-Year Plan, and two, to get elevated to a ministry 2 years later in 2007, which makes a huge difference. That's a step up. Everyone at every level throughout the country who works for them suddenly got a pay raise, which helps, but they also got more power vis-a-vis their counterparts. Other big ones were the Thai Lake algal bloom in 2008, and it's now been 2007 originally, but I got a picture off the web from 2008 because it's been going on every year since then. This is because of the amount of nutrients in the water. So they realized this chemical measure that they were using wasn't enough. They had to add new water pollutants. The effort to deal with air pollution at the Beijing Olympics was also critical because, again, it was being able to do it and showing that it could be done. Some of the measures that were taken were temporary, but the population saw, hey, we can get clean air if we try. And that's a really important message for people who have been essentially living in smog for 40, 50 years. People argue that the same was true for the LA Olympics in 1984. Seeing the sky can be a revelation for people who haven't seen it in a while. And so it's really been a transformation. And finally, climate change is now seen in very different terms than it was a decade ago. A decade ago, it was seen as a cost of mitigation issue only. It was seen as the rest of the world is going to pressure us to reduce our energy use before we develop, and we just need to fight it. But more and more, and especially because the science has improved and what the impacts are at mid-latitudes is much clearer now than it was before 2000. Chinese associate, in particular, droughts and floods with climate change and the risk to themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily think they want to mitigate more than anybody else, because just because they see the problem, that's all the more reason to make sure that developed countries live up to their promise in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to take the lead, as it actually says in that document. But it means that their participation is much more active, and they're very interested in seeing a positive result. But because of all the other reasons that I just listed, because energy security is important, because environmental protection is important, there are a lot of reasons why everything that they're doing to mitigate climate change, to improve energy intensity, to switch to non-fossil fuels, are things that they're doing because they see them as in their own national interest. And so China is in some ways a classic case of as a country got richer, it really has seen a lot of possibilities that a decade ago it really didn't see at all. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.